I grew up on a family farm, the kind of place most people imagine when they think of the perfect countryside. We had 20 acres of rolling fields, dotted with cows grazing lazily under the sun. Chickens wandered freely, pecking at the dirt near the old farmhouse that had been in our family for generations. And then there was the barn, big, red, and sturdy. It stood like a sentinel on the edge of the property, its weathered wood and towering frame a testament to over a century of history. The barn was more than just a building. It was the heart of our farm. Every morning, we'd head there to feed the animals and tend to the chores. It smelled of hay and earth, a comforting scent that I still remember vividly. On warm summer afternoons, sunlight would stream through its high windows, casting golden beams across the floor. It was a place of life, routine, and hard work, a symbol of everything simple and good about farm life. But as I'd soon discover, not all of its history was comforting. Some things were better left forgotten in the shadows of that barn. At first, the signs were subtle, little things that could easily be explained away. Tools would go missing from the barn, screwdrivers, hammers, pliers, nothing too valuable, but enough to make you scratch your head. We'd search high and low, through every corner and every shelf, but they were always gone. Sometimes, they'd turn up in the strangest places, like behind a pile of hay or tucked away in a corner where we were sure they hadn't been before. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe one of the farmhands had misplaced them, or perhaps they were just lost in the clutter of a barn that had seen better days. But then it started getting weirder. The animals began to act strange. At first, it was just the cows. They'd refuse to go near certain parts of the barn, standing at the farthest end of the yard, gazing up at the loft with eyes wide, their ears twitching. It wasn't the usual disinterest they had in certain areas. They were spooked. I remember one evening, when I tried to move them toward the barn for feeding, they dug their hooves into the dirt, their heads turned in unison toward the shadows of the barn. No amount of coaxing would get them inside. I thought maybe there was something in there, a mouse maybe, or a stray cat. We had our fair share of wildlife around. So, I shrugged it off as nothing to worry about, but it was beginning to gnaw at me. Then one evening it happened. After everyone had gone to bed, I found myself walking to the barn alone. I didn't think much of it at the time, just a routine check on the animals. The night air was cool, a soft breeze carrying the smell of freshly tilled soil. Everything seemed normal, but as I approached the barn, the weight of the silence hit me like a cold gust. It was the kind of silence that felt almost oppressive, like the world had stopped breathing for a moment. And then I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It started so softly I thought I might have imagined it. Step, pause, step. The barn, as old as it was, creaked and groaned with age, but this sound, it was different. It wasn't the usual rustling of the wind or the squeak of the building settling. This was too deliberate, too consistent. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, clearer with each passing second, echoing in the vast emptiness above me. It sounded like footsteps, but faint, distant, yet somehow close. Someone walking across the loft above me, but I was sure I was the only one out there. I stood there in the dark, staring up into the shadows of the loft, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The barn was empty, or at least it should have been. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, or maybe the wind shifting a loose board. But the more I stood there, the more the sound didn't make sense. There was no wind, no reason for anything to move like that. Step, pause, step. I took a slow, tentative step toward the barn door, my pulse quickening. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. I wanted to call out, but the words caught in my throat. Something felt wrong, deeper than I could explain. I thought about turning back, but the sound pulled me forward, urging me into the barn, like something was waiting. The cold air seemed to grow colder the closer I got, the hairs on my neck standing on end. And then I heard it again, louder this time, a heavy footstep, but there was no one there. I felt it, that undeniable feeling that I wasn't alone. I wasn't sure what to do, whether to run or keep going, but before I could make a choice, the sound stopped. The barn fell back into that suffocating silence. But now it was different. Now I was the one who was being watched. I stood there, frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, the sound of my own breath loud in my ears. The silence around me felt heavier, like it had a weight of its own, pressing down on my chest. Every creak of the barn seemed amplified in the stillness, like the building itself was groaning under the pressure. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Something was wrong. I wasn't imagining it. I tried to shake it off, but my feet felt glued to the floor. With one hand clutching the flashlight, I slowly stepped forward, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. The shadows seemed to dance on the walls, stretching unnaturally with each flicker of light. I told myself it was nothing, just an old barn settling, maybe some animals scurrying in the rafters. But every step I took felt like I was walking deeper into the unknown. The barn was eerily still. I could hear my own footsteps echoing back at me as I made my way toward the loft, the light flickering with every step I took. The higher I went, the thicker the air felt, as if the darkness itself was pressing down on me. I scanned the room, trying to reassure myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. There, on the wooden beams above me, were strange markings. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer, shining the light across the symbols carved into the wood, scratches, almost like claw marks. They weren't neat or deliberate. They were messy, jagged, as if someone had been desperate to leave a mark, to communicate something. I reached out to touch one, but my fingers hesitated just inches from the rough surface. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. It was as if the barn itself was aware of my presence, aware that I had discovered something it didn't want me to find. My breath hitched in my throat, and I took a step back. But that was when I noticed something else. There were other markings, scratches, scuffs, remnants of something that had been there for a long time. And the more I looked, the more I realized there was a pattern to it all. A story that the barn was trying to tell, but I wasn't sure I was ready to understand it. Before I could make sense of it, the silence around me thickened, and I could hear it again. That faint tapping sound, this time much closer. It was like footsteps, someone walking across the loft. But no one was there. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, louder than the sound itself, and I knew then. I wasn't alone in that barn. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was trespassing into a place that didn't belong to me anymore. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and my flashlight seemed to cast shadows that were too long, too strange. That's when I heard it, a blood-curdling scream. It ripped through the silence of the barn, sharp and raw, like the cry of someone in pain, desperate and terrified. I froze, my blood running cold. It was a scream that no animal could make, no creature I knew. I stood there, paralyzed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The barn was empty. There was no one there. I had just been up in the loft, and it had been empty then. Without thinking, I rushed toward the sound, my legs moving faster than my mind could process. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and I nearly stumbled in my haste to reach the loft. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest I could hardly hear my own footsteps. The barn doors creaked open as I rushed inside, the familiar scent of hay and dust mixing with something else, something foul, like rot. I burst through the door and into the loft, flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam flickered across the walls, and that's when I saw them. Shadows darting quickly across the far side of the loft, disappearing into the corners before I could get a good look. My blood ran even colder, and I could feel my throat tighten with fear. What the hell was going on? I didn't know what I expected, but it certainly wasn't this. I crept forward, flashlight scanning the area, my body tense with fear. As I approached one of the darkened corners, I caught sight of something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Food scraps, old, gnawed-on bits of bread and meat, half-eaten and left in a pile on the floor. There was more. Makeshift bedding, blankets torn and tattered, stuffed into a corner like someone had been using the loft as a place to sleep. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been living here. Someone had been hiding in this barn, and we had never known. There were no signs, nothing that would have suggested a person had been living here in secret. No footprints in the dirt, no odd smells, no strange noises, until now. And this wasn't just a few days' worth of food. It looked like someone had been here for a long time, possibly years. I stepped back, trying to process it, my head spinning. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this could have happened. Who was this person? Why had they been hiding in our barn? How had they managed to remain undetected for so long? And then, I realized something else. Something far more unsettling. The barn wasn't just hiding someone. It was hiding something. Something that didn't want to be found. The discovery of what had been hidden in that loft changed everything. We immediately boarded up the loft, sealing off the area where the food scraps and bedding had been found. My family was shocked, but they didn't question it. We all knew that whatever had been living in that barn wasn't something we wanted to confront. The barn was a place of work, of routine, of memories, and we wanted it to stay that way. But no matter how much we tried to forget about what happened, the sense of unease never really left. It lingered in the corners of the barn, in the creaks of the old wood, in the way the animals still refused to go near certain parts of the barn. Every time I stepped foot inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just the barn, it was me. I couldn't stop wondering if there had been something, or someone, lurking there for far longer than I had realized. We never found out who or what had been living in that loft. There were no signs of a person ever coming or going, no trace of anyone being there other than what we had discovered. The food, the bedding, the strange markings on the beams. They all seemed to point to someone who had been there in secret, watching us from the shadows. But who were they? What were they doing there? And why did it all stop so suddenly? To this day, I still wonder who or what shared that barn with us. I can't help but think there's more to that place than we'll ever know. Some things, it seems, are better left in the dark. I was just a farmhand, hired on for the harvest season. It was nothing new to me. I'd worked on farms before and I knew the drill. But there was something different about this place. It wasn't the land, or the weather, or the smell of fresh earth in the air. It was the cornfield. This wasn't just any cornfield. It stretched on for what felt like miles in every direction, a sea of green stalks swaying gently in the breeze. As far as the eye could see, it was just rows upon rows of thick, towering corn. It was so dense you could barely see through it. The tall, lush plants crowded together like they were hiding something, and the air felt thick and heavy, as if the field itself was holding its breath. I could see how someone could easily get lost out there. The field seemed endless, like a green ocean where the horizon was a blur, and no matter how far you walked, you never seemed to get any closer to the edge. At first, it was mesmerizing, almost calming, but as the days passed, the corn started to feel oppressive. I could sense the weight of it all, the way the stalks pressed in around you, the way the leaves rustled even when there wasn't any wind. It was beautiful in a way, but also unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a tiny speck, swallowed by this massive, endless sea of green. It was during one of my evening checks for pests that I first noticed it. The sun had just started to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. I'd been walking the same rows every day, checking for any signs of damage or pests that might be hiding in the corn. It was routine, something I'd done 100 times before, but that night something felt off. The air was heavier than usual, and I could hear the rustling of the corn as the wind stirred the leaves. At first it was just the wind, or so I thought, but then I heard it again. Whispers. They were faint, almost like a murmur, coming from deep within the corn. First I brushed it off. It was probably just the wind, or maybe my imagination playing tricks on me after a long day in the field. But the more I stood there, the more I heard it. A soft, almost rhythmic whispering, like voices carried on the breeze. It was so quiet, like it was just beyond my reach, but it felt purposeful. I shook my head and laughed it off. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the wind had a strange way of carrying sound through the stalks. I'd been working alone out there for a while, and I hadn't seen another soul in hours. My mind was probably just playing games with me. But still, as I turned to head back to the farmhouse, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. There was nothing there, of course, just the rustling of the corn. But the whispers, they lingered in my mind, like an echo I couldn't quite shake. As I turned to head back, the sun had already slipped low in the sky, and the shadows in the field grew longer, stretching out like dark fingers across the earth. I had done this 100 times before, knew the field like the back of my hand. I knew exactly where the farmhouse was, where the edges of the field were, and where the little paths between the rows of corn twisted. It should have been easy to find my way back. But the more I walked, the more something felt wrong. I passed the same row of corn more than once. At first, I thought I was just tired, but it became undeniable. I was turned around. The rows of corn, which I had walked down countless times, all looked the same. The once familiar landscape had become a maze, the stalks towering higher, more intimidating in the growing dusk. The soft whispers from earlier returned, barely audible at first, like the rustling of a distant breeze. But this time, the whispers were louder, almost urgent, swirling around me as if something, or someone, was trying to draw me deeper into the field. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. There was no wind. The air was still, thick with the scent of soil and plants, but the stalks, they were moving. The whispers, that constant murmur I had convinced myself was just my imagination, were growing louder. But it wasn't the wind causing the rustling. The stalks were shaking, trembling, but there was no breeze. It felt as if something was in the corn, moving, brushing against the leaves, whispering in the shadows just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried to calm myself. I'd worked here for weeks now. I knew this field. I was just disoriented, nothing more. But my heart was racing, and my feet felt heavy, as though they didn't want to move. I kept walking, trying to ignore the strange sounds that followed my every step. The whispers were now unmistakable, low, soft voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like it was coming from all around me, from within the very heart of the corn. I looked up at the sky. The sun was nearly gone, and the world around me was sinking into darkness. My flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker with every passing moment. I shook it, tapping it against my palm, but it didn't help. The light continued to fade, as if the field itself was draining the life from it. Panic surged through me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work again. The rustling, the whispers, they were getting closer. The stalks in front of me shook violently now, though there was no wind to explain it. The whispers turned to hushed voices, calling out my name, barely above a whisper, but loud enough for me to hear. I froze, my pulse racing, my breath shallow. Was it the wind playing tricks on me? Or was something or someone actually out there, moving through the corn, following me? I took a step forward, but my feet felt heavier now, like the earth was pulling me down, trying to hold me in place. I glanced behind me, but there was nothing but rows and rows of corn. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something or someone lurking in the shadows. The whispers were louder now, more insistent, like voices calling from deep within the maze of corn. It was as though the very field itself was alive, whispering secrets to me that I couldn't understand. I kept moving, even though my mind screamed for me to stop. The whispers were so loud now, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides. I didn't know where I was going, couldn't remember which way I had come from. The darkness was thick around me, the beam of my flashlight now barely cutting through the blackness. The corn stalks loomed like silent sentinels, and the air felt thick, like it was closing in. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a patch in the field where the corn had been trampled, maybe, or some odd formation of stalks. But as I got closer, I realized what I was looking at. An altar. It wasn't large, but it was unmistakable, roughly made, like it had been hastily thrown together by someone desperate to hide it. The stones were jagged and uneven, forming a circular shape in the middle of the cornfield. Inside the circle were strange symbols carved deep into the soil. They were crude, like someone had scratched them into the earth with a sharp object. Symbols I couldn't recognize. They looked ancient, almost tribal, but I couldn't make any sense of them. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I stared at the altar, my mind racing. What was this? Why was it here, in the middle of a cornfield, miles from the nearest house? There was no explanation for it. I felt the air grow colder around me, as though the very ground beneath me was pulsing with a strange energy. It was as if something had been waiting for me to find this place. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it. Presence behind me. I don't know how I knew, but I could feel it. Like someone or something was standing right behind me. I could almost hear the breath, slow and deep, just a few inches from my ear. My skin prickled, and I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, endless rows of corn, swaying slightly in the still air. But I heard it then, a low, heavy breath, right behind me. It was so close I could feel the warm exhale on my neck. Without thinking, I bolted. My legs carried me faster than I thought possible. The sound of my footsteps thudding against the earth, but the whispers, the heavy breathing, they followed. I didn't know where I was running, but I couldn't stop. The world around me felt like it was spinning, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, my foot caught on something. My body lurched forward, and I hit the ground hard, my flashlight flying from my hand. The beam flickered out, leaving me in total darkness. My heart was racing, my breath shallow and panicked as I scrambled to my feet, trying to steady myself. That's when I saw it. A piece of clothing discarded in the dirt. A jacket, torn and stained, the fabric covered in dried blood. My stomach turned as I reached down, my hands trembling. The jacket was so old, the blood so dry, but the image was seared into my mind, the unmistakable stain of something terrible. Something that shouldn't have been out here, in the middle of nowhere. My mind raced. What had happened here? Who had left this? And why did it feel like whatever had been watching me, whatever had been in this field, had been waiting for me to stumble upon it? I had to get out. I had to leave. But I couldn't stop thinking about that jacket, the blood, the whispers. I don't know how long I was out there. Hours, maybe. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly in that field. The darkness had swallowed everything, and I had lost any sense of direction. The whispers, the heavy breathing, they didn't stop. They followed me through the rows of corn, the sounds growing fainter as I stumbled and stumbled, praying to find my way out. The fear had rooted itself in my bones, but somewhere in that fear, I knew I had to keep moving, had to get out before whatever was following me caught up. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. The distant glow of the farmhouse light, barely visible through the wall of corn. It was small, but it was enough. I ran toward it, my legs like lead, barely able to push forward anymore. But the light, just the sight of it, gave me the strength to keep going. When I finally broke free of the cornfield, gasping for air, I collapsed on the ground, my body shaking from exhaustion, fear, and the aftershock of everything I had seen. I didn't know if it was real, if it was just a nightmare, but I knew one thing. I was done. I staggered back to the farmhouse, trying to keep my composure, but I could feel the weight of what I had just experienced pulling at my sanity. The farmer was inside, sitting at the table, his back turned as I walked through the door. I told him everything, the whispers, the altar, the blood-stained jacket, but he just shook his head, muttering something about too much time in the sun and the old field playing tricks. He dismissed it all like it was nothing, like it was all in my head. I didn't argue with him. I knew better. But the next morning, I packed my things. I didn't even tell the farmer I was leaving. I just couldn't stay. The thought of that field, the whispers, and the blood, it was all too much. I had to get away from it, from that place. And to this day, I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes. I can still feel the presence behind me. But more than anything, I'll never forget what I saw in that cornfield. That altar, the blood, those voices. I've never stepped foot on a farm since, and I never will. It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter, a chance for my spouse and me to leave behind the chaos of city life and find peace in the countryside. The farmhouse we moved into wasn't anything fancy. A modest, two-story home with peeling white paint and a creaky porch. It sat on a small patch of land surrounded by rolling hills and thick woods. The kind of place where you could lose yourself in the quiet. I remember the first night vividly. The air was so still you could hear everything. The soft chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves, and every so often, the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Our nearest neighbor was over a mile away, and the single dirt road leading to our house felt like a thread tying us to the rest of the world. At night, that thread felt like it could snap at any moment. But that's exactly what we wanted. Isolation, simplicity, and a fresh start. During the day, it was picturesque. The sun would bathe the hills in golden light, and the woods behind the house seemed inviting, almost magical. But at night was different. The shadows stretched long and deep, and the house felt too quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. I brushed it off as nerves, adjusting to a new place. My spouse and I reassured each other, this is good for us. We'll get used to it. At least that's what we thought in the beginning. It started on a cool, clear evening about 2 weeks after we'd moved in. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing off a plate after dinner. The window above the sink faced the back of the house, giving me a perfect view of the hills that rolled off into the distance. It was quiet, as usual, and the moon was full, casting a silver glow over everything. That's when I saw it. At first, I didn't even realize what I was looking at. On the crest of the nearest hill, there was a figure motionless, just standing there. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. It was tall, upright, and still. Too still. I leaned closer to the window, squinting, trying to figure out what it was. Was it a tree? A fence post? Maybe even a scarecrow? I laughed to myself, shaking my head. It's just a shadow, I told myself. The moonlight's playing tricks on you. But as I kept staring, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I called my spouse over, but by the time they got to the window, the figure was gone. I tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been an animal or some weird optical illusion. But deep down, something about it didn't sit right with me. I kept glancing back at that hill for the rest of the night, half expecting to see it again. When I finally went to bed, I told myself I was being silly. It's nothing, I thought. Just your imagination. But as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing so still, so silent, on the hill behind the house. It wasn't long before I saw the figure again. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself looking out the kitchen window, almost out of habit. And there it was, in the exact same spot on the hill, standing just as still as before. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, waiting for it to move to give me some clue about what or who it was. But it didn't. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the fading light. The pattern repeated itself night after night. As soon as the sun set, the figure would appear. Always in the same spot, always watching. It never came closer, never moved an inch, but its presence was impossible to ignore. I didn't say much about it to my spouse at first, not wanting to sound paranoid, but the unease was starting to build. Then the knocking started. It was faint at first, like a single tap on the glass. My spouse mentioned it one morning over breakfast. "Did you hear that last night?" they asked, frowning. It sounded like someone tapping on the bedroom window. I hadn't heard anything, but the idea sent a chill down my spine. Our bedroom window was on the second floor, well out of reach of anyone standing outside. The knocks came again the following night. This time I heard them too, a soft, deliberate tapping that seemed to echo through the stillness of the house. I jumped out of bed and threw open the curtains, but there was nothing there, just the pale glow of the moonlight spilling across the empty yard. And then, the strange things inside the house began. One morning, I woke up to find the front door slightly ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before going to bed. Another time, the rocking chair in the living room, which neither of us used, was facing a different direction, angled toward the window as if someone had been sitting there, watching the hills. The little things added up. Cabinet doors left open, objects moved slightly out of place. My spouse started noticing them too, and we both tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe we were tired, distracted, or just imagining things. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. And every night, without fail, the figure was there, standing on the hill, silent and unyielding, like a dark stain on the peaceful landscape. One night, the unease boiled over into sheer terror. It was past midnight, and the house was eerily quiet. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. Slow, deliberate creaks, like footsteps on the wooden floorboards downstairs. My heart raced as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, heavier this time. My spouse stirred beside me, their eyes wide with fear. Grabbing the shotgun we kept by the bed, I motioned for them to stay put and crept toward the stairs. Every step I took felt impossibly loud in the silence. The air was thick, almost suffocating. As I reached the bottom, I flicked on the living room light, and my stomach dropped. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading from the front door, which was wide open, to the rocking chair by the window. The chair was swaying gently, creaking as if someone had just left it. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I moved to shut the door, my hands trembling. And that's when I saw it, through the window, standing much closer than ever before. The figure was no longer on the hill. It was in the yard, just beyond the porch, its shape clearer now but still shrouded in shadow. Its head tilted slightly as if it were looking straight at me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, like it could see straight into my soul. Behind me, my spouse let out a gasp. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I saw something dart past the hallway, a blur of movement heading toward the back of the house. Panic surged through me as I bolted to check the back door, but it was locked tight. The windows were secure. I circled back to the living room, but when I looked outside again, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, the hill silent and still under the moonlight. It wasn't until I stepped back from the window that I noticed something lying on the porch. A single muddy boot, tattered and worn, covered in dried blood. I didn't sleep that night, neither did my spouse. We sat in the living room, shotgun propped against my knee, flinching at every creak and groan of the old house. The muddy boot stayed on the porch untouched, as if it were some kind of warning. By morning, we decided we couldn't stay there another night. I called the local sheriff, hoping for answers, though I wasn't sure what to even ask. When he arrived, I explained everything: the figure on the hill, the knocking, the muddy footprints, and the boot. The sheriff listened, his expression hardening with every word. Finally, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You know," he began, "this area has a bit of a history." He went on to tell us about an escaped convict who had been hiding in the area decades ago. They say he used to stalk families in these remote parts, watching them for days before breaking in. But he was never caught. I felt a chill run through me as the sheriff continued. "Now, I'm not saying it's him. Could just be some drifter passing through. But," he trailed off, shaking his head, "that was enough for us." By the next day, we had packed up our belongings and put the house on the market. It didn't matter if we lost money or where we went, we just wanted out. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the hill. It was empty now, the grass swaying gently in the breeze under the midday sun. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I haven't been back to that farmhouse since, and I don't plan to. The memories are enough to remind me. I'll never forget the figure on the hill, the tapping on the windows, the muddy footprints in my home. And I'll never live somewhere that remote again. To this day, I still wonder, was it the convict the sheriff mentioned? Or was it something else entirely? I'll never know. But one thing's for sure, whatever it wasn't just watching. It wanted us to know it was there,